Welcome to Dark Screen Chronicles. Tonight, we invite you to let go of your worries and step into the shadows of a tale shrouded in mystery. Close your eyes, listen to the rain, and let the story guide you into the unknown. Our story tonight is called The Whispering Woods. It's a tale of curiosity, courage, and the chilling secrets that lie hidden in the darkest corners of the forest. In the small, rain-soaked town of Hollow's Edge, there was one truth that everyone knew. The Whispering Woods were off limits. For generations, the townsfolk shared warnings about the strange happenings within the forest. It wasn't just the dense fog or the eerie quiet. It was the whispers, the ones that seemed to follow you, calling your name if you ventured too far. Claire was new to Hollow's Edge. She had moved there to escape the noise of the city, seeking solitude in the countryside. The warnings about the woods intrigued her. To her, they sounded like nothing more than small-town folklore, stories to keep children from wandering too far. On a rainy evening, when the sky was heavy with storm clouds, Claire decided to see for herself. The path into the woods was overgrown, hidden beneath a thick layer of wet leaves. Armed with a flashlight and a determination to prove the legends wrong, Claire stepped into the forest. The rain muffled her footsteps, but every other sound seemed amplified. The creak of branches, the drip of water from the leaves, and faintly, the whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she walked deeper, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. Her name, Claire. The sound was soft, almost inviting, but laced with something she couldn't quite place, a sense of unease that crept up her spine. Claire paused, shining her flashlight ahead. The beam illuminated a narrow, winding path that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches forming shapes that played tricks on her mind. The whispers continued, now coming from all directions. She told herself it wasn't real. The rain, the isolation, the stories. It was all just her imagination. But then she saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance. Was it another person? A reflection? Or something else entirely? As she approached the light, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They no longer called her name, but spoke words she couldn't understand, a language that sounded ancient and rhythmic. The light led her to a clearing where an enormous stone stood at the center. It was covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the rain. Claire stepped closer, her curiosity overriding her fear. The whispers turned into voices, overlapping and chaotic, as if a crowd had gathered around her, unseen. Her flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. She reached out to touch the stone, but the moment her fingers brushed its cold, wet surface, the whispers stopped. Silence. Complete and total silence, except for the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. And then she was no longer alone. As the darkness enveloped her, Claire's senses heightened. She could feel the air shift around her, as if unseen figures were moving closer. The whispers began again, softer this time, like a chant weaving through the rain. She turned frantically, trying to see something, anything, but the forest was impenetrable. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, then another. Shapes that seemed to blend with the trees, but moved unnaturally fast. Claire stumbled backward, her breath quickening. The rain felt heavier now, as if the forest itself was closing in on her. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The only response was laughter, low and chilling, echoing through the trees. She ran. The path she'd followed was gone, replaced by a tangle of roots and mud that pulled at her feet. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices that spoke in unison. They were closer now, almost as if they were inside her mind. Claire tripped, falling hard onto the wet ground. Her hands scraped against a jagged rock, and for a moment she thought she'd lost them. But then she saw it. The same symbols etched into the stone in the clearing, now glowing faintly beneath her. The ground beneath her began to shake, a low rumble that vibrated through the forest. The whispers reached a crescendo, their words forming a single, chilling command. "Stay!" Claire's mind raced. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain, and ran blindly into the darkness. The rain blurred her vision, but she could see a faint glow ahead. Was it the edge of the woods, or another trick? The whispers followed her, relentless and deafening. Branches clawed at her arms, the mud threatened to pull her under, and the glow seemed to grow farther away with every step. Exhausted and terrified, she finally burst through the tree line and collapsed onto the wet grass. For a moment, everything was silent. The rain continued to fall, but the whispers were gone. She turned back to look at the forest, but the path she'd emerged from was no longer there. Just an unbroken wall of trees, dark and foreboding. Claire didn't speak of what she'd seen. The flashlight and her mud-streaked clothes were the only evidence of her journey, but she knew the truth. The Whispering Woods weren't just a legend. They were alive, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in. And sometimes, on stormy nights, she swore she could still hear the whispers calling her name. Our next story is called The Forgotten Inn. It's a tale of solitude, strange encounters, and the haunting realization that some places should remain lost to time. The storm came without warning, sweeping across the countryside with a ferocity that left little time to prepare. Nathan drove cautiously, his windshield wipers struggling against the torrential rain. The winding, empty road seemed endless, the headlights barely cutting through the sheets of water. His GPS had stopped working miles ago, and his phone had no signal. With the night deepening and the storm intensifying, he knew he needed to find shelter, any shelter, before the roads became completely impassable. Just as his hope began to wane, a flicker of light appeared in the distance. It was an inn. The sign, swinging on rusted chains, read, "The Hollow Hearth Inn." The building looked old, but well kept, its windows glowing warmly in the stormy night. Relieved, Nathan pulled into the gravel driveway, his tires crunching loudly in the silence. He grabbed his bag and hurried inside. The interior was surprisingly inviting. A grand fireplace dominated the lobby, its flames casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The air smelled of aged wood and something faintly sweet, like spiced cider. Behind the counter stood a tall, thin man with a polite but unreadable smile. "Welcome to the Hollow Hearth Inn," the man said, his voice calm and measured. "A room for the night?" Nathan nodded, shivering slightly as the warmth of the fire began to seep into his rain-soaked clothes. "Yes, thank you." "The storm, it's bad out there." "Indeed," the man replied, sliding a large leather-bound guest book across the counter. "Sign here, if you please." Nathan took the pen and hesitated. The guest book looked ancient, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. As he flipped it open, he noticed names written in elegant, looping handwriting. The dates beside them, however, didn't make sense. 1923, 1876, 1814. He glanced up, but the man's polite smile didn't falter. Shaking off the unease, Nathan signed his name and handed the book back. The man handed him a brass key with the number 7 engraved on it. "Your room is upstairs, third door on the left," he said. "Sleep well." Pause as the sound of footsteps on wooden stairs fades in. Nathan climbed the creaking staircase, the faint scent of lavender growing stronger as he approached his room. The hallway was lined with old portraits, their subjects staring down at him with expressions that seemed almost aware. He shrugged it off and unlocked his door. The room was simple but comfortable. A 4-poster bed with a heavy quilt, a small writing desk, and a single window overlooking the forest beyond. The rain continued to batter against the glass, but inside, the room was warm and still. Exhausted, Nathan set his bag down and collapsed onto the bed. He must have dozed off because when he opened his eyes, the fire in the small hearth had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. A soft knock at the door startled him. "Who's there?" he called, his voice hoarse. No response. Just another knock, soft and deliberate. He got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The portraits seemed to watch him as he stepped out, their eyes following his movements. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed something strange. The guest book he'd signed earlier was lying open on the floor. His name was gone. In its place was a new entry. Nathan, room 7, forever. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. He picked up the guest book, his trembling fingers brushing the frayed edges of its cover. The ink under his name wasn't dry. It shimmered faintly, as if it had just been written. A cold draft swept through the hallway, carrying with it a faint whisper, "Forever." He spun around, his heart racing, but the hall was empty. The portraits loomed silently, their expressions seeming sharper, more menacing in the dim light. He clutched the book and hurried back to his room, locking the door behind him. Nathan set the guest book on the desk and stared at it, willing the strange entry to make sense. Maybe it was a prank, a strange, elaborate joke. But who would have done it? The innkeeper. And why? A sudden knock on the window shattered his thoughts. He froze. His room was on the 2nd floor, and the forest outside was too far for anyone to reach the glass. The knock came again, deliberate and sharp. He turned slowly, his gaze falling on the window. Through the rain-slicked glass, Nathan saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the storm. But its eyes, pale and unblinking, glowed faintly in the darkness. The figure raised a hand and pointed, not at the window, but at the guest book on the desk. Nathan stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, as if they were coming from inside the room. He grabbed the book and threw it across the floor. It slid to a stop at the foot of the bed, its pages fluttering open. The writing had changed again. In bold, jagged letters, it read, "Leave now." Nathan didn't need another warning. He grabbed his bag and yanked open the door, racing down the hallway. The floorboards groaned under his feet, and the portrait seemed to sneer at him as he passed. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. By the time he reached the lobby, the innkeeper was gone. The fire in the hearth had burned out, leaving the room cloaked in shadows. Nathan didn't stop to look around. He flung open the front door and ran into the storm. Outside, the rain was relentless, soaking him to the bone. But the glow of his car's headlights was a beacon in the darkness. He fumbled with his keys, his hands slick with rain and trembling with fear. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, urging him to look back. Against his better judgment, he glanced over his shoulder. The inn was gone. In its place was an empty clearing, the tall grass swaying in the wind. No sign of the building, the innkeeper, or the warm light that had drawn him in. He got into the car and started the engine, not daring to stay a moment longer. The road was slick and treacherous, but he didn't care. He drove as fast as he could, the headlights cutting through the rain. The whispers faded with the distance, replaced by the steady rhythm of the storm. Nathan didn't stop driving until dawn, when the rain finally ceased. Exhausted, he pulled into a small diner on the edge of a quiet town. He needed coffee, food, anything to shake the lingering unease. As he sat at the counter, the waitress approached with a warm smile. "Rough night?" she asked. "You have no idea," Nathan muttered, rubbing his temples. The waitress poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. "Well, you're lucky you made it out of that storm. Not everyone does." She hesitated, then added, "You didn't happen to stay at the Hollow Hearth Inn, did you?" Nathan froze, his hand gripping the coffee cup. "How do you know about that place?" Her smile faltered. "It's been gone for years, burned down in the 1940s. They say it still shows up during storms, though, for travelers who lose their way." Nathan's blood ran cold. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The waitress walked away, leaving him staring into his coffee as the whispers echoed faintly in his mind. story is called The Phantom Train, a tale of unanswered questions, spectral echoes, and the strange ways the past refuses to let go. The train station was abandoned, its platform slick with rain and overgrown with moss. Sarah tightened her scarf against the cold as she approached, her suitcase trailing behind her. She'd heard about this place in whispers, a station forgotten by time, nestled deep in the countryside. The locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed, but Sarah didn't believe in curses. She had nowhere else to go. The storm had chased her here, its winds howling through the trees as the rain battered the dirt roads. Her car had broken down miles back, leaving her to wander until she stumbled upon the old station. Its sign, barely legible through the rust and grime, read Gray Hollow Junction. The station was eerily intact. The ticket booth still stood, its glass cracked but unbroken, and the waiting benches sat empty beneath the shelter of the overhang. A single rusted clock hung above the platform, its hands frozen at 11:57. Sarah glanced at her phone. No signal. As she stood there, debating her next move, a sound cut through the storm, a low, mournful whistle. It came from somewhere deep in the fog, growing louder with each passing moment. Sarah's heart quickened. She peered down the tracks, straining to see through the haze, and then it appeared. The train emerged from the mist, its black engine gleaming despite its weathered appearance. It slowed as it approached the platform, steam hissing from its sides. Sarah stepped back, clutching her suitcase. There were no passengers inside, only rows of dimly lit, empty seats. The conductor, a tall man in an old-fashioned uniform, stepped off and tipped his hat to her. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice smooth, but carrying an air of something unplaceable. "Headed somewhere?" Sarah hesitated. I'm not sure. My car broke down, and I need to get to the next town." The conductor nodded. "Well, you've come to the right place. This train can take you where you need to go." She frowned. "But where is that?" His smile widened, but his eyes remained unreadable. "Wherever the tracks lead." Something about the man unsettled her, but the storm showed no signs of letting up, and the thought of spending the night at the station filled her with dread. She nodded slowly and stepped onto the train. The conductor followed, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of coal and something sweet, like lilacs. The seats were worn, but clean, their cushions a deep red. Sarah chose a seat near the window, her suitcase resting at her feet. The train lurched forward, the whistle sounding once more as it disappeared into the fog. As the minutes turned into hours, Sarah began to notice strange things. The window showed only darkness, the rain blurring any hint of the outside world. The other cars, when she peeked through the connecting doors, were identical to hers, empty and silent. Yet, faint voices echoed in the distance, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She returned to her seat, unease settling in her chest. She glanced at her phone again, hoping for a signal, but the screen remained blank. When she looked up, the conductor was standing at the far end of the car, watching her. "Is everything to your liking, miss?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. She nodded hesitantly. "Yes, thank you. How much longer until we arrive?" The train slowed unexpectedly, its wheels screeching against the tracks. Sarah leaned closer to the window, trying to see what lay ahead, but the fog was impenetrable. The conductor opened the door, stepping onto the platform of a station that hadn't been there moments before. Sarah's stomach dropped. It was the same station she'd boarded at, the same clock, frozen at 11:57, the same empty platform. She stood, clutching her suitcase. "What's going on? Why are we back here?" The conductor didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the door. "Your stop, miss." She shook her head, panic rising. "Number I need to get to the next town. You said this train would take me where I need to go." His expression softened, and for the first time, she thought she saw pity in his eyes. "It already has." Sarah stepped off the train, her legs trembling. The moment her feet touched the platform, the train began to move again, disappearing into the fog. She stood there, alone, as the rain fell around her. She turned toward the station and froze. The clock's hands were moving, ticking steadily forward. The second hand reached the top, and the clock struck midnight. The platform vanished.